Hi, I'm Richard from Electric Classic Cars, and this is my 1969 VW Crew Cab. It's my daily driver. And this is a teenager. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he's just got up and had his breakfast, and standing next to him is his daily driver. And that's what this episode is all about, choosing his first car, whether or not it's going to be electric or petrol, and the costs associated with that. Now, my first car back in the day was a 1968 VW Beetle. No safety features whatsoever, and that's not what I really wanted for my son. I wanted a bit more safety, airbags, modern car, ABS, etc. And there were some other preferences as well, like 30,000 miles-ish second-hand. Now, you quite fancied the Renault Zoe from the off, didn't you?
Yeah.
So Oliver's preference from the off was an electric Renault Zoe. I was concerned it was going to be a little bit too pricey. I was preferring something. What's your cars that your mates normally have?
Normally a Ford Fiesta.
Ford Fiesta, there you go. The standard go-to car for most people who have just passed their test is something like Ford Fiesta. So that's what we're going to do in this episode. We're going to crunch those numbers that I crunched when I was comparing the electric Renault Zoe to the Ford Fiesta and came to quite a surprising conclusion. Now, there's a number of criteria to take into consideration when buying your first car. Number one is the cost. Now, this was 6,300 quid. It's a 2017 Renault Zoe 40 kilowatt hour battery pack, and that's the first year the 40 kilowatt hour battery pack came out. So if you want the cheapest Renault Zoe of that type, 2017 will probably be the year that you'll be looking at. Now, when we're considering a comparative, the Ford Fiesta is also a crossover year because 2017 is when the new shape came out for that then as well. And there's a 1.1 litre Ford Fiesta, same power, same 0 to 60, 5 doors, etc. that we compared it against. And the cheapest we could find on Auto Trader today for one of those at 30,000 miles as well, same amount of miles as this, was 8,500 quid. And that was surprising. I thought the Ford Fiesta would be cheaper than this, but when you compare an apples to apples, that Ford Fiesta was more expensive than the electric Renault Zoe. So we've established a Ford Fiesta is a very good comparative to this Renault Zoe, but let's talk about the cost of ownership. So first on that list would be tax. Now, who out there remembers these things? Tax discs. I know you do, Tim, you're that old. Oliver behind him is going, what's that? And I've got to say, Oliver, for a teenager, I'm quite impressed with how tidy it is in here. Because back in the day when me and Tim were teenagers, back when things were black and white, our cars were not this tidy, were they, Tim?
I don't know, I don't agree. I was just having a go at him for the fact it wasn't very clean.
Really?
Inside out. Yeah, mine was much
you were
cleaner.
Sad, mate. My car was filthy. But anyway.
You met my dad, haven't you?
Yeah, that's true. Back to the cost of ownership. So, road tax. Now, road tax this year on electric vehicles is free, but that's going to end according to the budget. And it's not really clear, I don't think, what it's going to be for electric cars next year. So, taking worst case scenario, the Ford Fiesta is 180 quid a year tax. So for our cost comparative, I've gone year one is free for this, but 180 quid for the Ford Fiesta. And I'm just going to assume that worst case scenario, the Renault Zoe is going to be the same tax as their Ford Fiesta for year 2 and year 3. So as far as road tax is concerned, over a course of 3-year cost of ownership, I'm going to say that the Renault Zoe is just 180 quid cheaper. Right, let's talk about fuel next. So for the Renault Zoe, actually, let's set the scene first. So it's 3 years cost of ownership. We've taken an average of 10,000 miles per year, so that's 30,000 miles total over 3 years. Now, starting with the Renault Zoe, the efficiency of this is around about 3.7 miles per kilowatt hour. So I'm going to have to get the numbers out because I'm never going to remember all these numbers. So 3.7 miles per kilowatt hour. To do 30,000 miles, we figured out that's 2,700 kilowatt hours you'll need. Now, when it comes to the cost, we at home charge up at night time, always black and white. it's a law at our house. You have to charge up at night on the cheap rate, which is 7.5 pence per kilowatt hour. So we've assumed, based off historical evidence, if you like, of my wife's Tesla, she's had it for a few years, 90% of charging happens at home, 10% is with public charging, and we've taken 65 pence per kilowatt hour as an average for public charges. So with all that taken into account, the cost to fuel this up for the next 3 years and do 30,000 miles will be £1,074. The Fiesta, so this is a Ford Fiesta 1.1 2017 model. The book miles per gallon efficiency is 64 miles per gallon, pretty good. And to do 30,000 miles, that means you'll need 710 litres of fuel, which on average today is £1.45 per litre of fuel. I had to ask Tim that because I have no idea. So when you take all that into account, the cost of fuel for the next 3 years in the Fiesta to do 30,000 miles would be £3,090. So essentially £2,000 more in fuel for the Fiesta than the Renault Zoe. Right, so that's fuel. Next is insurance. Now, insurance has been going up dramatically recently, and it's quite scary how much the insurance costs for a first-time driver like Oliver. So what we've got are numbers for me being insured in this car and having Oliver as a named driver. And insurance group, this is 16, the Fiesta is 5. So you'd be expecting the insurance to be a lot higher on this compared to the Fiesta. But what are the numbers? Well, the numbers are £2,200 a year for the Renault Zoe and £1,877 a year for the Ford Fiesta, which means over the course of 3 years, £6,600 for the Renault Zoe or £5,631 for the Ford Fiesta. So just under £1,000 difference there, and the Renault Zoe is more expensive. But just to give you an idea of how much more money you have to pay in insurance for somebody like me or me with my son as a named driver, the Renault Zoe was £2,200 for me to get insured on it with Oliver as a named driver. But if it was just me, it would be £250. That's like nearly 10 times less. That's nuts. Right, next comes depreciation, and this was the one that was worrying me because reading all these news stories about EV depreciation and stuff, it was concerning. But when you look into the numbers, it's quite surprising. So how do we crunch these numbers? Well, I went on to Auto Trader because we can't, magically go into the future and see what the car prices are going to do in 3 years' time. So what I did is I took a 6-year-old version, so not a 2017 but a 2014 Renault Zoe and Ford Fiesta, and I added 30,000 miles onto the clock. So what we were looking for is how much is a 2014 Renault Zoe with 60,000 miles on the clock. And the cheapest one we found was £4,175, which means that take off the original purchase price of this, which is £6,300. That means depreciation estimate, because that's what it is £2,125. But when we did the same for the Fiesta, the cheapest one we could find there was £4,690, which meant that depreciation was £3,800. So the depreciation on the Fiesta is quite substantially a lot more than the depreciation on the electric Renault Zoe. Is that a surprise to you guys out there? Because it was to me. Right, so those are all the considerations and all the numbers, but let's get in the warm now and total them all up on the board. So, in conclusion then, I've drawn up this cost matrix here so you can see what the scores of the doors are, and we'll start off with cost. So, Renault Zoe cost and the Fiesta cost, that meant that the difference is £2,200. So the Renault Zoe works out £2,200 cheaper. Don't forget that's a 2017 car, 30,000 miles on the clock, and then all of these numbers here are based off 3-year ownership, 30,000 miles. So the fuel, again, the Renault Zoe ends up being £2,000 cheaper. Tax, now I should say tax is free this year for EVs, but next year they're going to take that away. So I've taken worst case scenario for year 2 and year 3 on the Renault Zoe is going to be the same as the Fiesta. I don't know if it will be the same or slightly less, but I've taken worst case scenario. So that, it works out 180 quid cheaper for the tax, not that much really. Depreciation was a surprise for me. If you believe all the media, you think, oh, electric vehicle after so many years goes down to next to nothing. Well, actually, the Renault Zoe worked out less depreciation than the Fiesta. So again, the Renault Zoe, 1,685 quid cheaper than the Fiesta. Insurance was more expensive though, because the insurance group on the Zoe was higher. So that worked out in the Fiesta's favour, 969 quid more expensive for the Renault Zoe. So when you take all that into account, the cost of ownership over 3 years, the Renault Zoe actually ends up nearly 3 grand cheaper over 3 years than that 1.1 litre petrol Fiesta. And if you take into account the cost to buy the car in the first place, then it works out 5 grand cheaper for the Renault Zoe versus the petrol Fiesta. Is that a surprise for you? Because if I'm honest, that's more than I expected. I was expecting to be around about on parity because I thought, well, depreciation might be more for the EV, the fuel will be less, etc. I thought they'd all balance out. I didn't expect it to be that high. So, was that a surprise to you guys out there? So there you go. Now I think you can get an idea why Oliver is in a Renault Zoe, because compared to his mates in a Ford Fiesta, this is saving him 3 grand every 3 years. And in fact, if you take into consideration the purchase price, it's more like 5 grand over 3 years he's saving. But more importantly, is the car right for you, mate? What do you reckon of it?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Decent car. Acceleration's good. It's a nippy car.
It's a nippy car. That's not something I really want to hear as a first car for my son. In fact, that reminds me, after a few weeks of driving when I was younger, I managed to roll my car, so I better just check there's no...
That was your mum's car, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was my mum's car. Thank you for reminding me there. I rolled my mum's car 2 weeks after I passed my test. But so far, so good with Oliver's Renault Zoe. In fact, I've just remembered your first car, Tim, was a Ford Escort Mark II.
1.3L.
1.3L, and you used to call it the Beast, but everybody else used to call it the Shed. So question to you guys out there, what was your first car? Because I bet it wasn't an electric car, was it? My first car was a 1968 VW Beetle, which I still own today. And on that note, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you on the next one.